Greetings from the World Class Teaching Program at the University of Mississippi. This is Tammy Kirkland, and we are going to discuss Component 4. Prior to beginning this discussion, there are a few materials that you need. You should have already completed the Choose Your Module component as well as the available resources. If you have not done that, I need you to stop the video now and go back and make sure you do that, because in order to make this training meaningful and purposeful and personalized, you will need a copy of your certificate standards and a copy of your Component 4 instructions. If you have not done that, then please stop the video at this time, go back, choose your certificate, and get your needed resources, and then click play and rejoin me. This portfolio component is called Effective and Reflective Practitioner. It rolled out new 6 years ago. The old Component 4 that was in National Board 1.0 and 2.0 involved accomplishments. This one does not. So if you were talking to any MBCTs that certified several years ago, please do not let that confuse you. Component 4 is completely different now than what it used to be. So this portfolio entry requires you to demonstrate evidence of your abilities as an effective and reflective practitioner. There are 3 different parts involved in Component 4 plus a reflection, developing and applying knowledge of your students, using assessments to effectively plan and positively impact your students' learning, and your collaboration to advance students' growth and learning. Now, let me give you a heads up about Component 4. It has an excessive amount of forms that go with it. These forms download in the folder. When you downloaded your resources, it downloaded in a folder. In that folder, you found a PDF with your Component 4 instructions, which you have in front of you, and it also included all of these editable files. You can see that it appears to be Word copies. So what you will do is just open them and edit them on your desktop. But we're going to talk a good deal about the forms. I want you to have a good understanding of what they are there for. Component 4, people are either on one side of the fence or the other about Component 4. I will let you know that Component 4 is our program's highest scoring component. We have people every single time to score a 4.0 or higher on Component 4. Keep in mind, 3.75 is as high as you can get. Once you understand what the component is asking you to do and how everything works together, something clicks. You have to look at this component as one component. If you separate every single part of it, you're going to make it a lot harder than what it is. Component 4 is like riding a bicycle. Think back to when you learned how to ride a bicycle. It didn't click for a while, but once it clicked, it was there. Probably if you've not ridden a bicycle in years, you could hop on one, and after wobbling for a little while, you would take off. So I really want you to synthesize all the different pieces of Component 4, and remember, they go together. So let's look at this. These are the parts of Component 4. We begin with knowledge of your students. Now, knowledge of your students will be used with the generation and use of assessment data. That is just the assessment cycle. That's all that is. Then you have a component called PLCs. This is actually the smallest piece of the whole puzzle, and I will tell you it is the piece that gives teachers the biggest problem. I'm hoping that I can clarify that for you and you will not have that issue. But again, it deals with PLCs, which I know you have a lot of experience in. And then, of course, there is the reflection piece. So let's take it piece by piece and work our way through Component 4. As with all of our components, open up your component instructions and look at page 1. It's going to tell you what you need to do, and I will tell you we are all doing the same thing in Component 4. So it's a very common language. It also has the standards that you must meet in Component 4 on page 1 and 2 of your Component 4 instructions. And if you take a look at those standards, and again, it won't be all of your standards, look at the last 2 to 3 standards mentioned. you will address standards in component 4 that are not addressed in any other component. And those are the standards about collaboration and advocacy and leadership. So make sure again that you complete a standard activity, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And we've got that in WCTP 601, our candidate support course as well. So back to the beginning, now that you've looked at your standards, the first piece of this puzzle is knowledge of students. This is not a new concept to teachers. You're going to gather a lot on this group of students. I will say you will know this group of students more than any other students. Now, the important thing is for you to identify who is your group of students. If you team teach, or if you teach middle school and high school and you teach multiple sections, you will complete component 4 with one group of students. And it will be your entire classroom. You cannot only do component 4 with a small group of students unless your certificate says so. And it only says that, if I'm not mistaken, for exceptional needs. For the majority of you who are general ed teachers, you will complete this with your entire group. So pick out one classroom, one section of students that you will do this with, okay? And you will complete the group profile form and the knowledge of student commentary, which is 2 pages long. You will use this data to help you complete the rest of component 4. Some of the basic things we're going to ask, but on a very deep level, are who are your students? Where are they academically? You will collect at least the following data on these groups of students: learning styles test, interest inventory, parent inventory. Oh, did I say that? Yes, I did. That is absolutely essential that you gather data from the parents in this, parents or caregiver, and of course, assessment data to see where they are academically. Okay, that's just a little view. We're going to go back and go over this in greater detail. Generation and use of assessment data, and you must use knowledge of students that you collected in that first piece. See that piece? You use that knowledge for this piece. In this piece, the data is going to identify an issue, a deficiency, which you will address with the assessment cycle. It will be an academic objective. Let me repeat that. It will be an academic objective, okay? And this is 5 pages, so you can see this is definitely the biggest piece of this puzzle. It will include formative and summative assessment materials, as well as 3 student self-assessments that are linked to your formative assessments. And we will recommend that you use teacher-made assessments. Don't let that scare you. I'm going to tell you how to make that really easy. And again, this is just the assessment cycle. And the big takeaway from this is really and truly is formative assessment. I know we all know what formative assessment is, but this portion of this component will make you slow down and really revisit formative assessment and its purpose. Then we have the learning communities. This is only 2 pages, okay? You will identify a student need and a professional learning need. You will have 1 page for each. Now, guys, I want you to keep that in perspective. Do not let something that is only 1 page long make this commentary and this component very challenging for you, okay? You will use knowledge of students to identify both needs. Not at the same level as we did on the others, but obviously if there's a need, you have to have data to identify the need. Here's a big thing about this need. You have to have pre and post data, okay, for both needs to prove that your actions impacted student learning, your student learning, okay? And you will collaborate with others in the student learning need. Now, I guess you're sitting there listening thinking, well, that wasn't that bad, and you're exactly correct. It's not that bad, okay? Once you really wrap your head around it, it's not. Then you have a reflection that's 3 pages long, but look at it. Question 1 reflects on the very first puzzle piece, knowledge of student. Question 2 reflects on generation and use of assessment data. Question 3 reflects on your PLC communities. And then, of course, you will see that familiar what's coming next. So even though it's 3 pages long, it is laid out to correspond with what you've done in the component. So the reflection is not difficult at all. But I do want to give a shout out here. Follow the suggested page lengths. I can't tell you how many assessors that, I've had conversations with that have told me that, they've been reading for people and things looked absolutely wonderful until they got to the reflection, and for some reason the teachers decided a half a page was appropriate. No, it is not. Keep in mind, the very people that are assessing you created those page recommendations. Follow the recommended page lengths, okay? That will make life so much easier for you. So now let's dive into each one of these. Again, that's the picture and how they all work together, okay? They all work together. Our main focus will be on the knowledge of students, the generation and use of assessment data, and PLCs, okay? The reflection, as I just went over, is self-explanatory. So let's dive into each one of these pieces. First off, what will you be asked to do? Now, I want you to open up your component for instructions, okay? And let's go over this. We talked about this briefly. You will provide a profile or description of one group of students that you select during your current school year. So for all of you, this will be the next coming school year, okay? And again, that group of students will represent your entire class if you are a general ed teacher. It will be the entire students in your class, not all of your students. If you team teach middle school or high school, you will choose one section or one class to complete component 4 with, okay? You will provide evidence that you collect relevant information, and you will use this information throughout the rest of this component. You will submit evidence that you accumulated knowledge of your students from the current year or previous years. When we say previous years, this component is going to ask you to identify a trend. That's where the previous school year comes in. Obviously, you're experienced teachers. If you've taught this grade level for multiple years or the content for multiple years, you can identify before the school year even begins, oh, that objective is going to be a doozy. They're going to struggle with this. I'm going to have to slow down with this. You can take your state test scores. Not only do your classroom assessments identify a trend and just your general experience knowledge, but if you have test score reports from a high stakes test like the Mississippi test or your state's test, it's going to give you your students' classroom performance, your district performance, and the state's performance. And you can look at all of those to help identify trends too. So again, when we talk about the previous year, we're only talking about the previous year in regard to identifying trends, okay? You must link assessment data to your practice. This is a data-driven component, and I know a lot of you have data. You will submit evidence that you accumulated knowledge about students from the current year, and you will analyze the effectiveness of your own practice to initiate or contribute to collaborate efforts in your school, district, community, or other learning communities. That's talking about the PLC part, the professional learning needs, okay? So now, let's take a look at this. I really like this, and I will tell you that the Component 4 module in WCTP 601 is very strong. And again, each of you that register with us will have an MBCT mentor. All of our mentors mentor face-to-face. Even our online mentors use Zoom. You should not consider Zoom meetings optional if you're an online candidate. They are part of your mentoring experience. Do not skip out on that or you will only be harming yourself, okay? So again, you will have access to a mentor. And that mentor will lead you through and help explain things to you as you complete your components. However, WCTP 601 is used differently for online and face-to-face candidates, but all candidates should use that. It will be detrimental to you if you do not, because there is no way that your mentor can possibly cover everything that is in those modules, all right? And it really does a good job of explaining component 4. Now, what I want you to look, you see everything that's in blue is a form that you will submit. If it's not in blue, it's not a form, except the instructional content form. I'm not sure why I did not highlight that one in blue. But let's take it by chunks, okay? Knowledge of students, okay? Beginning with that, back up one space, I'm sorry. You have the contextual information form, and that is with every component. That's where you identify where you teach, who you are, who your students are, your setting. That's where you identify your mandates. Do you have mandates? You absolutely do have mandates. Your state objectives and a school pacing guide are your mandates. National boards will not tell you what to teach. Your state tells you what to teach. You are expected to continue teaching your state objectives. The national board just expects you to embody your certificate standards and the architectural of accomplished teaching as you demonstrate your teaching for them, okay? So in red, you see the three different components of component 4 that we're going to talk about. Knowledge of students, that is what the written commentary is called. There is a form that you will fill out, group information and profile form. It is background information, okay? And then you will submit evidence, which is probably some sort of learning style or some sort of data that you've collected from your students. But again, you see these forms, guys, they are supporting documentation. Do not think of them separate from the portion that they go with. That is a very big mistake. Also, you should complete your forms prior to completing the written commentary because they are supporting information and background information. And you can see in generation and use of assessment data, we know that's 5 pages. We know that's the big piece. You do have an instructional context form. You will submit a formative assessment, a summative assessment, 3 students' self-assessments, and then you have a form for each of those explaining those, okay? And then data, of course, from the summative assessment as well and from the formative. For the participation in learning community needs, remember you will have 1 page for your professional learning need and 1 page for your student learning need. And you can see they're very similar. The professional learning need, evidence of how you met the need, that's your professional need and your impact on your students. And then the student need, evidence of the need. Again, we have to show the data that identifies the need. Evidence of the impact on student, but look what's in this. Evidence of your collaboration with others to meet the need for a total of 12 pages. Now, the thing about component 4 is it's a journey. Who are you? Who are your students? How do you meet their needs? And again, keep it all together. Do not separate this or you will make this much harder than it needs to be. Okay? Let's take another look at your standards. If you look at Proposition 5 in the Architect of Accomplished Teaching and the 5 core propositions, you have teachers are members of learning communities. And this is something that did cross over to the new component 4. You will demonstrate you are a leader, a collaborator, and a leader, and family and community partnerships, which hopefully you've done that throughout all of your components, but it is an absolute requirement in this component, and I'll show you where and how. So how does it vary by certificate? Again, standards addressed are individualized. If you are an early childhood generalist and you have a friend that is an English language arts certificate and y'all are sitting side by sides and you open up your page 1 and their page 1 of your component 4 instructions, what's going to be different are your standards because each certificate has different standards. And then your group, that's the students that you will focus on throughout this. Again, if you are a general ed teacher, your group is your whole class. You cannot choose to focus and gather data only on a few students, okay, if you are a general ed teacher. Your group is identified in your component instructions under the overview heading on page 1. So take a moment right now, pause this video if you need to, look at your page 1 and under the overview, who is your group, okay? And again, just going over the outline and the flow. This is a middle childhood generalist example. You have the first 2 pages are just a general overview. What do you need to do? What standards do you need to meet? Then it gets into this, and I would tell you there is so much knowledge when you start wanting to know more about each of these topics embedded in your instructions, okay? Then you have, of course, your written commentary. You're familiar with that. That's what you will submit. You have your electronic submission at a glance. Again, I cannot stress how significant that document is. You have your forms, and then you have your rubrics. And again, these are just a copy of your forms, right? Your fillable forms are in your folder that downloaded from the website. And then you have your level 4, 3, 2, 1 rubric. Okay? Your written commentary, just an overview. These are the suggested page lengths, which we've already discussed we want to follow. Knowledge of students is 2 pages long. Generation and use of assessment data, 5 pages long. Participation in learning communities, 2 pages. Reflection, 3 pages. And again, follow the suggested page lengths, okay? I've also heard teachers say, well, the entire amount of the written commentary, let's see, is 12 pages long. I only have 10 pages. Is it okay if I submit that to the national board? No, I'm going to tell you it's not, because if you submit 10 pages rather than 12 pages, there are 2 pages worth of evidence that you are cutting out. So if it says 12 pages, you want to submit 12 pages, okay? And we'll help you with that. And one of the easiest ways to get on track is to follow the suggested page length. Sometimes teachers are tempted to think like, oh, you know what, in the PLC 2 pages, oh, I can do a much better job if I submit 3 pages and make the reflection 2 pages. Well, if you do that, you really, really hurt yourself, because the national board has established that it takes 3 pages of evidence in order for you to reflect on this component the way you should in order to certify. So just make sure you follow the page length. Now, let's talk a little bit more about knowledge of students. Okay, you have a contextual information form. You should be familiar with this by now if you are working your way through this. And you can see it's identifying your school program, the type of school program, how many students, what courses you teach. And here, question 3, you see that question about state mandates, district mandates, and again, we have already talked about 2 that everyone will have, and that is your state objectives is a mandate and your school pacing guide, okay? And access to technology. Technology is required in the National Board certification process. This statement does not eliminate the need for you to use technology. It just provides an opportunity for you to explain how much technology you have access to. Okay? Now, here's our knowledge of students written commentary. What I want you to do now is skip on over. We're going to skip all of the information in the middle of your instructions. I will let you come back and read that earlier. It will go into detail about knowledge of students and generation and use of assessment data and professional learning needs and all of that. I want you to skip over to the written commentary. So again, if you need to pause the video, do that. Skip over till you find your questions that you have to answer. And I want us to discuss this. This will help you to determine what kind of data you need to collect. What and who were the sources of the information you gathered? Okay? What and who? I will tell you that you're going to have a form that will ask you how you gathered that information. And let me just say again, there are no duplicate questions between the commentary and the forms. There are several questions, particularly in Component 4, that are very close. And if you encounter a question on a form and a commentary question and you think, I've already answered that, first off, you have not, okay? So what you need to do is go to that form, find that question, find the question in the written commentary, and compare the 2. Lots of times it is just simply like what and who, in the commentary versus how in the form. What and who, again, is not the same as how. So just wanted to throw that out there, and that will eliminate that confusion for you, okay? So what and who were the sources that you gathered? What guided you in selecting the particular sources of information? What were the sources appropriate for, why were they appropriate? And how did you determine the importance of the different kinds of information you gathered? So now let's think about this. We know what we're going to do with this data, right? We're going to use this data for the assessment cycle and to identify needs of our students. If you teach multiple subject areas, okay, then I would suggest you choose a specific content area to collect data on, okay? Now that is separate from the learning styles test and the interest inventory. You need to do that, okay, regardless. And then your content, all right? So let's say you are a math teacher and you know you're collecting information on math. I would say probably narrow down some of the data that you collect. You can use trends in the past. You might do a pre-test at the beginning of the year to identify weaknesses. You might use star reading, but let's say that you identify that fractions are an issue. Then you would definitely want to gather specific data on fractions. Adding fractions, dividing fractions, fraction word problems. You need to collect data that identifies a specific problem, okay? Also, when you're doing that interest inventory, you won't do an interest inventory, a broad interest inventory, just to find out what their interests are. You will use this later on when you are developing resources and activities. But also don't forget, you can do an interest inventory on the content in the subject itself. For example, you could do a math interest inventory. Let's find out, do these students have a fixed mindset or not? Okay, or a growth mindset, all right? And again, you want to identify information from the parents or the caregivers. Find a parent inventory or make your own where you identify information from the caregivers. You know, if you're secondary, then you'd want to know, does your student have a job? Does your student have a curfew, a bedtime? Does your child have access to technology? What motivates your child? What causes your child to shut down? What are your concerns for your child? What are the strengths of your child? Does your child have someone at home that can help them? This is the type of information you want to gather from your parents, okay? Then, of course, you want to identify academic, because again, we are assessing academic objectives in the generation and use of assessment data, okay? Again, let me say that, academic objectives, okay? So you have to have data, academic data, test results to also show that that is an issue. Then it's going to ask you, what are the trends that you identified from multiple choices? Now remember, we talked about that at the beginning. How did you identify the trend and how did you confirm the trend? Now part of that can be teaching experience. You have taught this grade level in this subject area for multiple years. But you can also use, like we said, high stakes test data, a common assessment that your district does. But you have to find information to identify the trend. And that trend being that deficiency that you see in your students that you're going to take through the generation and use of assessment data, okay? What is something they need work on? What other factors did you take into account and why? And then based on your analysis, what are the needs of this group of students and what kind of supports do you anticipate providing? Now, these supports need to be beyond what we normally do, okay? Another thing important to remember is national boards is not your state accountability model. The state accountability model says you cannot make any accommodations for any students unless they have an IEP. National board says you should accommodate for any students based on their needs. So that is lifted for you when you are completing the national boards in regard to what you're submitting to the national boards, okay? But we talk about what supports do you need. Maybe you need to find someone who can offer after school tutoring for your students. Maybe you can collaborate with your family members, your community. All communities have retired teachers. Maybe you get in touch with these teachers and you bring some of them in to help these students after school. Maybe you have a college professor that can come and do an activity with your class. Maybe you have a student's parents who are a doctor or a nurse, and if you're doing science, maybe they can come in and help explain something. So keep your mind open as to how you will collaborate and use the available resources that you have. Okay, this is what the group form and profile form looks like. Describe the information about the group of students you collected from multiple sources and how you collect it. We're describing the information. In the commentary, we're identifying what and who were the sources of the information. What and who were the sources? Now we are going to describe the information that we collected. What does that information look like? What did it tell us? Okay. Then you're going to describe a group of students that you selected to feature in this portfolio entry based on the information gathered. Notice it said portfolio entry. It didn't say just a part of this portfolio, okay? So again, describe this group of students. And you know all classes have personalities. Of course, you have a variety of diversity in every class, but some classes are more um, competitive than others. So regardless, you're going to describe this group of students, okay? Then let's talk about the data. Why is data so important? What sources can you gather data from? Now, what's in red is a given. You need to do those. Also, state test, end of the year grades. Do not neglect how important those grades on those report cards are. You all have access to cumulative records of your students. When you cannot take them to the room, you get in big trouble for that. But you can definitely go in there with a list of your students and write down their year average. And you will see very seldom does that year average change more than 3 points in each content area. Go and look at that. Progress monitoring programs, probably all schools have these now. This is when you are asked to give an assessment, and it's always looking at the benchmarks on the pacing guide. You are monitoring how your students are doing at the very beginning of the year to see how on target you are to reach the goals at the end of the year. Previous teachers, and now keep in mind you're only doing this with one section of all the classes that you teach, right? Unless you're self-contained. And if you are self-contained, you probably don't have any more than 25, 27 students. Find out who their teachers are. Shoot that email to that teacher. It can be the same email, just copy and paste it and change the student's name. That will be such a valuable source of data. Ask that, and when you're sending that, just don't say, "What can you tell me about Johnny?" Okay? By this point, your data should have already identified a need that you're going to be working on. So you might, if it's comprehension, you might say, "Can you tell me anything about Johnny that will help me this year?" Particularly in regard to reading, okay? Also, don't forget your counselors and special education. If you have any students in your room that go to out for inclusion, gifted, or even if it's speech, do not disregard those educators, because more than likely those special educators have a relationship with that student that expands a year. So they probably know them better than you do. There's a lot you can learn from them, okay? If they have an IEP, make sure you familiarize yourself with the required accommodations or modifications that you will be expected to follow. So what do we want you to do when school starts in August? Well, during the summer, and we'll talk about this in another training, we just want you to read your component instructions and get so familiar with your standards. Then when August rolls around, August looks different every year. The recording of this is being made during the COVID-19 pandemic. So August will definitely look different for you teachers who are beginning in August of the fall. But even if you did not have COVID-19 to deal with, August still brings a lot to deal with. You have to unpack that room. You have all of these new students. You have to collect data. You have to see what's changing at your school. You may have some different administrators. So what do we want you to do in August? The realistic thing that you can do is to collect data. Get you a notebook. Get you a half-inch notebook, okay? Once you choose this class that you're going to do this with. And now I will say, if you are doing components 2 and 3, obviously if you choose the same class, then you can use the same data, okay? So that's something to consider as well. So collect data and put it in a notebook at the beginning of the year. Create a data notebook. That's what we want you to do in August. Behind each student, put their interest inventories, put their parent inventory, any information that you have, okay? Collect that data. That's all you need to do in August. That's all you will have time to do in August. But collect purposeful data, okay? Make sure you're familiar with the data that you need prior to beginning your school year, because it will be additional data from what you normally collect, okay? Now, knowledge of students. You will use this data to complete the following sections: generation and use of assessment data, professional learning communities, okay? Familiarize yourself with the rest of component 4 before you collect your data, all right? Generation and use of assessment data, okay? Let's talk about this. This is the big chunk, the 5 pages. You will demonstrate the assessment cycle. And this is what the assessment cycle is. It involves pre-test, formative assessment, self-assessment, and summative assessment. You will use assessment and knowledge of your students to drive instructions. The big takeaway in this, really and truly, is that formative and self-assessment that you will guide your students through. You will use that information to adjust your instructions. If you just gather it and look at it and you don't make any changes, then you're not doing this the way you're supposed to do, okay? Now you must identify an objective or objectives to assess. It needs to be measurable. None of this, I want to increase their love of reading. Not here. That won't work for generation and use of assessment data, okay? That is something we might consider, might not consider as a student need. We'll talk about that later. Here, this needs to be an academic objective. It absolutely must be measurable, okay? And when I say one objective or more, lots of your objectives scaffold. Like if you're doing main idea, think about all of the related objectives that the students have to include in order for you to assess main ideal. You know, if you are doing subtracting fractions, what do they have to know previously? Well, obviously they have to know their facts, they have to know equivalent fractions. So for that reason, it may be more than one objective, but again, those objectives come together to identify a very specific need, okay? Choose one of your standards that your knowledge of students relates, that your knowledge of students identified as difficult for your students. So again, look at those academic standards, objectives, pick one that your knowledge of students identified as difficult or challenging for your students. And again, we said prior to that you would kind of lead the collection of that data just based on your knowledge of the skills that are hard traditionally for kids anyway, using your knowledge of trends, okay? Here's the assessment cycle. Establish learning goals, provide learning opportunities, assess, and use the results. That's exactly what the National Board is going to ask you to do. You're just going to have to analyze it all along the way. Analysis is so significant in your writing, okay? Now, open up your instructions again. We are in the Composing Your Written Commentary section. We have already looked at knowledge of students, so flip the page, and now let's look at generation and use of assessment data. And notice what I've highlighted. How did you use knowledge of this group of students that you collected and developed and the unit objectives to inform your planning of this unit? Now let me stop here too, because one thing that we've not talked about lately are your standards. Your standards are the sole basis of your certification. And what happens is teachers become very mindful of their standards at the beginning. Then school starts, all right? And then they start focusing on the commentary, like we are right now. What do I need to do? So your focus shifts from the standards to what do I need to do, and then it will shift again to writing it up. Now, let me tell you, if you do not include the standards, you will not certify. Again, it is the sole basis of certification. You will find that in your scoring guide. So, as you are planning this commentary for component 4 or any component, you want to plan with your standards from that component in front of you, okay? We don't get to the end and write and say, oh, where can I integrate a standard here? It's too late then. The teaching has been done. Let me say that again. You do not want to get to the end of this process and do your writing and then think, oh, where am I going to integrate a standard? It is too late. You have to front load those standards, okay? In your planning, you plan with the standards beside you, okay? Specifically, now look at this. You see how you've got this question? And then down below that, they're going to help guide you on how they want to answer that. Specifically, how did this knowledge inform the kind of assessments, formative and summative, that you plan to use? And any modifications that would be necessary given students' learning modalities, social, emotional growth, exceptionalities, and abilities and interests. That tells you there should be modifications based on some of that, okay? Then what steps did you take to ensure the assessment provided consistent, fair, and accurate information? You know what I want you to do? I want you to hold your finger there on your hard copy, or if you're looking at your instructions and they're electronically, it's going to be a little bit harder. That's why we recommended you print them out, but you still can. You can hit pause. I want you to look at these questions, and I want you to flip over and look at the component, the level 4 rubric. Look and see if you can find some of the same terminology in it, and you will, okay? You will find it. When it talks about assessments being provided clear, consistent, and fair, look for those words in your rubric. You'll find it. And guess what else you'll find? You'll find an explanation of what the National Board is looking for you to do. They will identify steps that you could have taken to have made sure it was consistent, fair, and accurate, okay? Use that rubric. It is such an amazing tool because the rubric aligns with the standards, and these questions align with the rubric. It's all woven together. The more time you put in at the very beginning, discovering the relationship between your standards, your rubrics, and your commentary questions, the easier this will be for you, okay? Then, what did your analysis of the results of the formative assessment tell you about where the students are as a group in relation to the unit objectives? What patterns, trends, or outliers did you see? Cite specific examples from the submitted evidence, okay? What other factors did you take into account? And then what adjustments? See this? Adjustments are not optional. They are required. You should make adjustments. If they blow away your formative assessment with a 90% mastery, then you need to move on and scaffold to something else. In reality, that's probably not going to happen, okay? Do not be upset if your formative assessment results are low. Again, that's a big takeaway, and there are actually a lot of teachers that when they get to identifying that professional need, identify formative assessment or providing feedback as their professional need, because they discovered when they were taking their students through the generation and use of assessment data that they had really been lacking on formative assessment. Humor me for a moment. I want you to consider sometime in your past when you've given a summative assessment and your students did not do well. Let's say the class average was 70% or below. And as a classroom teacher, you weren't happy about it. You prepared those students well. You went over the activities. Maybe you even gave them a study guide, and then they still got to the final summative assessment. And again, the class average is a 70. That means there are kids who are below 70. And you know, as a classroom teacher, sometimes we may say things like, well, you know what? that's on them. They didn't study. They had the opportunity to, they didn't study. When in reality, yes, they are part of the equation, but you know who that's really on? That's on us. Because had our formative assessment been what it should have been, leading up to that summative assessment, we would have identified that the students were not where they needed to be. So don't feel bad if your formative assessment results are not good. Take that as an opportunity for you to go back and reteach, to include additional information before you move on to your summative assessment, okay? That is just good, accomplished teaching, all right? And then what were your analysis of the summative assessment? What did they tell you about your students as a group in relation to the unit objectives? What patterns or trends? How did it inform instructions as you went forward? So that means you've already taught some more. And obviously, if there's still some students lagging, we'll do some more. You know, if you're doing math, maybe you realize you need to use more manipulatives and more hands-on activities. And then how did you use students' support of self-assessment during the unit to achieve the unit goals? We'll talk about self-assessment in a moment, okay? First off, let's spend a moment talking about the assessments that you give. You will have to submit the formative assessment that you give your students as well as the summative assessment. Now, when I say that, you can't submit a copyrighted assessment. It is your choice whether you use a teacher-made assessment or a copyrighted, but you cannot submit a copyrighted assessment. So first off, let me show you some information down below that they're going to ask you about this assessment, okay? These are questions that you actually have to answer. Look what's in blue. How did knowledge inform the kind of assessments, formative and assessments you plan to use? So that means the information that you gathered about the students, how did you use that information to decide what your formative and summative assessment was going to be? Look at this. How was the assessment developed? Now let's have a get real talk. I know you already have a copy of your assessment for that objective. All teachers do, okay? That's what teacher manuals are. They include assessments. If not, maybe you have a common assessment that you give. So what do? You take that assessment that already exists and you make it your own using knowledge of your students. We do not want to submit an assessment that is all multiple choice. That's not a high quality assessment. Now, I know we do that a lot in school and we do that for grading purposes. Again, this is not school, this is national boards, okay? We look for diversity. So, like your summative assessment, make sure you have some, maybe you have some multiple choice, you have open-ended. You definitely want open-ended. Maybe even a portion of your summative assessment, maybe 30% of that is a project that they do with a friend, okay? That is allowable in national boards, okay? So again, and the formative assessment, you just would not want to complete, just don't do a worksheet and send that in. Make your own. And even on your formative assessment, we always want you to include an open-ended question as well. So again, what we want you to do, what we suggest you do, it is your choice, but I'm telling you, you see what's in blue? How are you going to answer these questions if you use an assessment that is in your teacher manual that was created 10 years ago? How are you going to explain how the information that you collected from your knowledge of students helped you to plan that assessment? Truth is, you can't, right? Unless you go to Piaget and cognitive development and levels and all of that, which you should do that anyway. But I'm making this easy for you and I'm making this meaningful for you, okay? So again, take the assessment that you normally would use and adapt it, recreate it using knowledge of this group of students, okay? So there you go. That should be good. Also, any assessment that you submit, it should be completed by the students. Don't you submit a blank one. When you submit a copy of anything, it should always be completed because that's just an opportunity to submit more evidence, okay? Here's your formative assessment material. It's just describing the assessment, how the results used, provide content for examples of the student self-assessments. We're going to talk about that in a moment, okay? Here's your summative assessment. Again, you've just got to explain how it was developed, how it was used, how it was administered, all of that. Different types of assessments, and I'm just doing this for clarification because we do see teachers who want to use the pre-assessment as the formative assessment, or they want to use the pre-assessment as the summative assessment. That is not an accomplished teacher practice. Don't do that. Whatever you're doing for your generation and use of assessment data, you need a pre-test, okay? Then you will do a formative assessment that you create, all right? Now, when you create that formative assessment, you need to have that summative assessment in front of you, right? Because we want anything that's on the summative assessment should be represented on the formative assessment. You can't get halfway through teaching the unit and just do a formative assessment on half the skills that's going to be on your summative assessment, okay? So the formative assessment has to represent everything that's on your summative assessment, okay? Ways to display data. And the reason this isn't here because you do have to display the data of your entire class, pre and post, multiple times in this component. You can actually use an online tool to do that, or you can do it by hand. If you do it by hand, that's usually when you've got, maybe 10 to 15 students or less. Otherwise, I would suggest you just go online and do that because, again, it has to represent your entire group of students. Now let's talk about the students' needs you consider. Let's see, where are we going? Okay, we talked about this earlier about your trend. We talked about the different places you can identify a trend. Formative assessments. These are some good formative assessments, and let me point out that you will do more than one formative assessments. Teachers do formative assessments every single day. You will just submit a formative assessment to the national board, okay? But make sure you reference multiple formative assessments as you're going through this, all right? All of this is in your Component 4 module. This is actually, those are different types of formative assessments, and these are reasons for formative assessments, okay? And again, this isn't new. Just like Component 2 is differentiation. Differentiation is not new for teachers. Using different teaching modalities in Component 3 is not a new concept, and neither is formative assessment. Really and truly, what we're doing is we're revisiting some of the foundations of accomplished teaching when we go through this national board process, okay? Student self-assessments. Now let's talk about this. Must follow the formative assessment. And I always like to begin this discussion with why? Why would the national board ask us to get our students to self-assess? Well, as a classroom teacher, you know how many times have you passed back a test and students said, "Oh, I thought I knew that," right? We hear that all the time. Why do they think they've known the material when in reality they didn't? Probably because we were teaching, we were doing a review, and they agreed and they nodded their heads yes. A self-assessment is actually a very uh, reliable and significant tool. It's a significant skill to teach your students because it teaches your students how to assess themselves before the summative assessment, okay? So a little bit about this. This will follow your formative assessment, meaning you do it at the same time, okay? You will give the same self-assessment to all your students, all right? Think about that. If you have a class of 25 different students, would you really give 25 different self-assessments? No, you will not. You will create a self-assessment that allows for individualization, okay? Now, the National Board suggests you use a rubric, a checklist, but also include an open-ended question in there. That's where you get the individualization. If you are an early childhood generalist, if you're sitting there and you're a first grade teacher and you said, "Oh, I can't do this," you absolutely can do this. You're just going to do it a little bit differently. You see this? You're going to transcript the conversation between the student and teacher. So if you got an assistant in your kindergarten or first grade, put those students in a center, put them in a group, and let the assistant help walk you through doing this, okay? You will, when you submit these 3 student self-assessments, they need to be completed. And I always suggest you find at least one student that you accommodate for. Maybe you have a student that has dyslexia. Maybe you have a student that's ADHD. Maybe you need to use a color overlay. Maybe you need to read these questions to a student. Just take this opportunity to show the national boards how you can still accommodate, okay, even though you're using the same self-assessment. And don't forget to look at those self-assessments of the students, okay, in collaboration with your formative assessment, okay. I have a friend that went through this process and she discovered that her feedback was not what it should be. And guess how she discovered that? On the student self-assessment. The students did not understand uh, that their self-assessment revealed that the teacher did not spend enough time elaborating on questions that they missed. Okay, so there's a lot to learn from this. Summative assessments, a lot of different ways to do summative assessments. Again, you're going to submit your summative assessment 2 pages. This comes from the National Board itself. Consider selecting pages that show different types of assessment questions or activities. That's what we talked about earlier, not just having a multiple choice test, diversifying it, at least with some open-ended questions. And again, part of your summative assessment could even be a group project. That's up to you. Assessment quality and submission. Assessment should match objectives. This is not a real big issue for experienced teachers, but do double check that. It should include a variety of DOK range. If you look at it, it's all DOK 1 and DOK 2. You need to go back and redo. That's why if you incorporate an open-ended question, you're automatically going to get that DOK level up, okay? And again, the assessment results must include results for your entire groups of students, not a subset, all right? Providing feedback. Feedback is not advice, praise, or evaluation. Good job. Oh, I can tell you studied. Way to go. Oh, that's better. That's not going to cut it, okay? It's got to be meaningful. And there's different ways that you can do that. One of my favorite ways to do, and I'll be honest with you, I learned this from national boards, was small groups. Now, when we think of small groups and conferencing, we do think a whole lot of reading, don't we? We think about conferencing with students and their reading. I'll let you know, I did conferences across the content area after I did national boards. And what I would do is, like if I did a formative assessment, I would put my students in groups based on who scored an A, who scored a B, C, D, maybe didn't score D, maybe lower, and let them come to me at the same time. That way the students felt comfortable in that group. It was a safe environment, and we could really get down and look at the mistakes they made. You might also group conferences by specific skills. Feedback should be timely and immediate. So you want to definitely provide feedback. A great way, if you have never done exit slips, oh my goodness, check out exit slips. They're amazing. Very few questions. Number one, they have to put their name on it. Something you learned today that you did not know. Something that you are still confused about. Okay, and you could be specific if you're doing math. What did you learn today from this lesson that you did not know? What are you still confused about? And that gives you feedback of where to begin the next day, okay? Effective feedback occurs during the learning when there is still time to act on it, okay? It could be a whole group discussion or small group conferences, but you are going to have to elaborate. There are questions that you have to answer about how you provide feedback to students. Okay, that was it for generation and use of assessment data, okay? Now let's talk about the participation in learning communities, the student need and the professional need. And here are the questions. Go ahead and take a moment, turn that page to your composing your written commentary to your participation in learning communities. Questions, 2 pages, 1 page per question, okay? So let's look at the 2 questions. The first question is the professional learning need. That is for you. What factors of information did you consider in determining how to meet the need? What impact did addressing the professional learning need have on student learning? That is your student learning. Those students in your classroom, okay? You have to prove that when you met your professional need, that it had an impact on your student learning. So keep that in mind when you are determining what this professional learning need is. And then your student learning need. Now look what's in blue. This must require advocacy, collaboration, and or leadership. So we're going to get someone outside of our classroom involved in this student need. Who did you work with? What was your role? Guys, this can be your parents. Okay? This can be your parents. This can be your team. If you are a science teacher, it may be your science colleagues. Okay? If you are a fourth grade teacher, it may be your fourth grade teacher. It may be a combination of both. What factors of information did you consider determining to meet this student need? Was the need school-wide or content specific? Okay? What impact did addressing the student need have on student learning? Now, let's have an open conversation here. Teachers really can do a hard job of making this harder than it needs to be. You have choices to make. Your generation and use of assessment data must immediately be connected to your knowledge of students, okay? Your student need may or may not be connected. Let's say your generation and use of assessment data had to do with an objective concerning fractions. Well, your student need may be getting your students to use visual representations when they are working with fractions. Okay, you see how that's related? It's so much easier if it is related. Let's say you choose something differently. Let's say you choose motivation to read, increasing student motivation to read. Now keep in mind, this has to be measurable. How are you going to prove that you met that student need? You have to collect data, qualitative or quantitative, okay? That it does that. And you need to bring it back to your classroom. Now, it may impact more than your classroom, okay? You may very well do something that impacts all of the students at your elementary school, but it also needs to come back and impact your students. Same on this professional learning need. Your professional learning need, for example, when I did National Board Certification, I started a newsletter for my classroom, a very specific newsletter. No one did newsletters in our classroom. Our assistant principal loved it. Guess what? He made every teacher in the school do a newsletter. When he transferred schools, I saw him a couple of years ago. Guess what? He was building principal. Every teacher in his school had to do a newsletter. Fortunately, he promised he wouldn't tell them that idea came from me. But you can see how that professional learning need, how did it impact my students? Well, the parents had to sign it. So therefore, the parents were being made aware of upcoming assignments and assessments. And guess what? That impacted grades because they were studying with their students. So that's how it had an impact on me. But you can see how it went beyond and impacted the other as well, okay? Now, your professional need doesn't do that. That's just you. It can go beyond you, but it has to be with you. I'm using that as an example to talk about what advocacy and collaboration might look like. For example, if you identify a student need is using visual representation, you might bring in a college professor. Matter of fact, they'd love to come to your room. You would have a hard time getting them out of your room. They might do a math night for your entire grade level or school level on how to use manipulatives with fractions, okay? Now that is just a direction that you can go, but the important thing to do is remember it has to be measurable and it needs to come back to your students, okay? So if you keep that ahead of time, again, the more you know on the front end, the easier it is on the back end, okay? And that's it. That's all you got to do for the professional in learning communities. And again, choose something doable. Lots of times I think people try and choose things that are so grand. National Board is looking for your analysis, okay? And look, it's making you collect data and show you made a difference, okay? So choose something meaningful that will help you and your students. And again, that professional learning need, if we're talking about math and you want it connected, it can be. Maybe your professional learning need is maybe if you're teaching the fractions, maybe you teach it the same way every year. Maybe you need to learn some new modalities of how to teach fractions. Okay? Or again, it might stem from the generation and use of assessment data. I've seen a lot of teachers identify meaningful feedback and a meaningful formative assessment as their professional learning need because they realized when they were going through the generation and use of assessment data, they weren't using it as they should be using it. Okay, so best advice I can give you on this is do not complicate this. Okay, do not make it more difficult than it needs to be. Things to remember: knowledge of student is used to identify student needs. Student need must require advocacy, collaboration, and or your leadership. And again, get your parents in on that. Think community resources that you could pull in to help you. Knowledge of students and your assessment practices are used to identify your professional need. Pre and post data must be included on both to show how they were impacted in student need. But again, that can be qualitative or quantitative, okay? Professional need, they can be related to each other, but they do not have to be, okay? It's easier if they are, all right? But they do not have to be. Brainstorm needs that existed in your classroom in the past. Brainstorm professional learning needs that could directly impact your students. Here's the forms that you fill out: your instructional context form. Here's your professional learning needs form. And again, remember, no questions duplicate themselves. There's your student need form. Make sure you pay attention to what's in the gray box because lots of times you can find some additional information in there. Like here, we're talking about the impact of the collaboration on the plan was intended to benefit. And see, it's talking about colleagues, students, other students, families, caregivers, school community. Okay. Then your reflection, and again, the reflection is, I love how the reflection is outlined on this. You have 3 pages. You're going to reflect on your knowledge about your students, your assessment practice, how it evolved, your professional learning and collaborative learning communities, and then you're just going to do the reflection that you see with every component. Where do you go from here? Okay? And now I hope you have a better understanding of component 4. I really like component 4, and again, keep in mind that they all do fit together. It makes it so much easier and doable. Do not let anyone confuse you on this, okay? You have the directions in front of you. Any questions, email me. Thank you so much.